All right, with that being said, I want to go ahead and we're going to launch into what I wanted to talk about. Let me get over here to share screen. Boom, boom, share. And is everybody seeing the full screen now? Fantastic. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about Doolittle's Raid, but even better than that, as we get started, I'm going to put up a little video clip. It's only a couple minutes long from the History Channel talking about the Doolittle Raid. So I'll give you a little visualization of what's happening before I launch into showing you some pictures and talking about it myself. So here from the History Channel.
Mid-April 1942. Sailors on the deck of USS Enterprise notice that the air is getting chillier. They've been operating in the steamy South Seas for weeks, and now the brisk weather is making it very obvious that they're sailing north. Only the Admiral seems to know why. At roughly 6 a.m. on the morning of April 12th, the men of the Big E and her task force notice a completely unexpected sight in the distance. It's their sister carrier, USS Hornet, but she's carrying mysterious cargo.
There was something wrong with Hornet's silhouette. What was wrong with it is the flight deck was half covered with these big, strange-looking airplanes that were not painted Navy colors, and they weren't naval aircraft. They finally figured out they were B-25s, and they had Army camouflage painted on it.
The Army B-25s are here to make a bombing run on the heart of Japan. Target: Tokyo and other industrial centers around Japan. Objective: take out factories and munitions plants and demoralize the enemy by assaulting her homeland. Strategy: attack with 16 B-25 bombers launched from USS Hornet.
I don't like to use the word revenge, but sure. I mean, there was some revenge that they wanted to get some back. No, they were mad, and they weren't to stand for it then, and we don't stand for it now. You reach out and you've hurt us, we're coming after you. And you know what? There ain't a damn thing you can do about it.
Army Air Corps Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle has agreed to lead the daring mission. And he's chosen the B-25 as the aircraft on which to trust his life. The North American Mitchell B-25B is a twin-engine medium bomber with a range, depending on bomb load, of about 1,300 miles. It's typically manned by a crew of 5 and can deliver up to 5,000 pounds of bombs. While other bombers have more range and power, the B-25's modest wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches will allow USS Hornet to fit more bombers on its flight. The plan is for the carrier to get Doolittle's bombers within striking distance of Japan. They will then launch, bomb Tokyo and their other targets, and continue on to land in friendly remote Chinese territory. In order to ensure that Doolittle's bombers have enough fuel to reach the designated landing area in China, Hornet and Enterprise need to get the planes within 400 miles of the Japanese mainland, but bad luck intervenes.
We ran across this little, what we thought was a fishing boat. Turned out to be a patrol boat. We didn't pick it up on our surface radar. It was that small.
So they had to launch, and they had to launch right then and there. There was no turning back.
The carriers are 650 miles from the Japanese mainland. It means Doolittle and his men might not have the fuel to make it out safely. They choose to go anyway. April 18th, 1942, at 8:20 a.m., the B-25 Mitchell bombers prepare for takeoff. This is the first time a B-25 has attempted to take off from a carrier in combat.
Now, that aircraft wasn't designed to be taken off an aircraft carrier, so they really had to get as much wind over the deck as possible because wind over the deck translates to flying speed off the angle.
Once the bombers are speeding down the flight deck, there's only 2 places they can end up. With enough speed, they'll be in the sky. Too slow, they'll be in the sea.
Taking off in a high wind, high sea environment is always tricky. Your number one priority right there is going to be making sure that the aircraft is lifting off the end of the deck when the bow is high.
Making it even more difficult, bombers have been stripped of all non-essential items to make room for more fuel bombs. even heavier than usual. Colonel Doolittle himself is the first to go.
You got all these aircraft stacked up on the flight deck, so first guys to take off have the least amount of runway.
Doolittle's bomber struggles off the deck, but manages to stay airborne. Four hours after launch, the bombers finally reach their targets. Despite enemy flak, each plane drops 2,000 pounds of hell into the heart of the Japanese homeland. They then turn toward the Chinese coast and their designated landing area. But as the last drops of fuel funnel from the bombers' tanks, most of Doolittle's air crews have no choice but to bail out or crash land. 3 crewmen perish in the process. 8 are captured by the Japanese. The physical damage done to Japan has been negligible, but the psychological impact is truly significant on both sides of the Pacific.
It was definitely a morale booster, not only for our servicemen, but for our whole country. Time of war, when the enemy is getting nailed at the heart of their homeland, it makes you feel like, you know what? You try to stop us, ain't happening. We're coming after you. It showed the Japanese that they weren't invincible, that we could reach out and we could touch them.
So fantastic. A nice little short beginning overview of what we want to talk about here. But the whole Doolittle Raid actually got its genesis when the president, not long after what happened at Pearl Harbor, basically made a pronouncement that he wants to figure out how to bomb Japan as soon as possible. So that is what kind of spurred the idea in a lot of people's heads of trying to find a solution to that. The actual brainchild behind all this was a Navy captain, so an 06 colonel equivalent, who was one of those in charge of anti-submarine warfare that was watching bombers take off one day and made the statement of, "I'll bet we can take a bomber off of an aircraft carrier." So he was the one that said, well, maybe that's a way that we can solve what the president's asked us to do. That brainchild then was handed over to Jimmy Doolittle. At the time, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, there's a picture of him, West Point, as a lieutenant. An interesting individual. We're going to talk about him a lot, but one of the things that just stands out to me is when he stands up, he is shorter than everybody else around him. So a short man overall, but huge when it comes to air power and what we're going to talk about. But, you know, the raid ends up named after him, but the whole idea, figuring out how to do it and then executing it, fall on him. He is the innovator that's going to make that happen. So Jimmy Doolittle himself, just very quickly, was born in Alameda, California, but grew up most of his time in Alaska. If you know anything about Alaska, trying to get around there, especially Nome, is way out there. So aviation is the way that you get around a lot of places. I can't imagine what aviation was like in those early years prior to World War II in Alaska, but I'm guessing that it was kind of on the rough edge of safe, just trying to get around day to day. He ended up attending Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley. First cross-country flight, he was into aviation early on in his life. Now, a couple interesting things is he went along from Berkeley and got a doctorate from MIT in aeronautics, the first ever doctorate in aeronautics from MIT in 1925. So taking this knowledge, this background, this aviation spirit that he had, very much into racing, acrobatics, and everything in airplanes. So one of the first things he did was he actually performed what people thought was impossible, an outside loop. So think of how an airplane flies a loop. Now just turn the airplane the other way. So it's a negative G that he's pulling from the outside there. Most people did not think that was even possible, but in 1927, so not long, you know, even into the whole idea of flight, here he is doing these types of maneuvers. This guy with a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT. A real important one that I can't foot stomp enough, he pioneered the use of instruments. flight instruments that we, today understand. If you fly into a cloud and everything else, it's how you're able to stay upright, navigate and everything. He is the one who started that. He was the one who innovated that. And then, of course, was awarded what ends up being the genesis of what even makes airline and whatever travel practical to this day. We're all looking here at Jimmy Doolittle and this man. He was a flight instructor in World War I, reserve officer recalled to active duty during World War II. And we'll talk about, the in-between war influence here in a little bit. Married his spouse in 1917. Now, he wasn't always so successful. This is actually a picture of one of the crashes of Jimmy Doolittle's, one of the crashes, plural. He walked away from this. You'll actually hear a little bit later on, I believe I have it in the slide, where he had a hurt knee during the operation, and it's kind of good how he ended up landing in China, and we'll talk about that. But this is a crash site, and he walked away from it, and there's everybody wondering how he did. So the first pursuit group was actually based at Selfridge. So this is where we're gonna get a little bit of a local tie. So Jimmy Doolittle was one of those. When we talk about Selfridge being the quote unquote land of the generals, one of those generals, one of those people who was the pioneers flying with that first pursuit squadron out of Selfridge was Jimmy Doolittle. You can see some of the other names up there of individuals. I actually tried to find a picture. I don't know if this was on Selfridge or not, but tried to find a picture of Jimmy Doolittle at Selfridge. So I'm not sure I was successful, but he kept some pretty darn good company when it comes to aviation history. And for those of you who don't know the history of Selfridge, that would be a whole other fun brief. But pretty much anybody who was a pioneer in military aviation had some degree of roots at our Michigan hometown air base. Now, you heard in the video, they talked about the other bombers. So when Jimmy Doolittle was tasked with coming up with this plan to fly, a bomber-sized airplane off of an aircraft carrier, he looked at multiple designs that existed. There were 3 other models, and they're listed up there, and I'll kind of let you look at that. But you also heard in the video, they talked about the wingspan of the B-25 and how, with its relatively shorter wings, they were able to fit more airplanes. Because these other ones might have been practical, but they certainly wouldn't have been able to fit 16 of them on an aircraft carrier. But whether it was for range, wingspan, or any other considerations, of the 4 they evaluated, they ended up going with the B-25 Bravo or B-25B. So when they looked at the airplane that they wanted to fly, they did a lot. You heard them talk about how the airplane was so heavy, but they actually removed a lot from the airplane to reduce weight. And they added more fuel to be able to make it go farther than it was intended to. They wanted to go with a 2,000-pound bomb load, so they did all the math accordingly. But they took out the lower gun turret. You can see some of the equipment that they took out. Radios. They've added tanks. The fun one that I liked is they talked about the gun barrels and the tail cone. The guns were removed and they replaced them with little wooden broomsticks. And apparently that worked because the few fighters that tried intercept them never flew near the tail of the airplane because they thought they had guns back there. They took out that cosmic Norden bomb site and they came up with own. I've never really been able to find out a whole lot of details of it, but I do like the fact that the materials to make the bomb site cost 20 cents, which is a little bit, at the time, obviously a little different, but I'm still saying that's relatively cheap by any way you want to measure it. There was a couple bombers that had cameras, and I think there's some pictures I put in there. We don't have a whole lot of pictures of the raids themselves, but a couple of the airplanes still had cameras that were mounted in them. So they modified these airplanes quite extensively to try and do what they needed to do. So they selected crews, 24 crews at this point. So there were more crews than actually ended up flying the mission. They picked up these modified bombers and flew them down to Eglin in the panhandle of Florida. So this is now, looking at the timeline, we're in what, March? It's covered up on my screen right there. And that's an early picture of the time frame that they would have been at Eglin in Florida. So they're trying to take these bombers. They start by painting the length of an aircraft carrier on the runway, practicing the short takeoffs that it would take, et cetera, to be able to make that work. Once they figured out, based on their flying at Eglin, they took 2 airplanes and actually put them on the deck of the aircraft carrier itself, the one that they were going to be using out of Virginia. So there was a test flight. They took B-25s off of an aircraft carrier off the east coast of the United States as a test. And you can see the time frame once again that we're talking about. But that is the Hornet itself, the very same aircraft carrier. So the 16 airplanes and crews, and these are lined up in order at which they took off of the carrier for the mission itself. These are the 16 planes. You can see that the first one off was Jimmy Doolittle himself. You heard that Top Gun graduate on the video saying because the way they were stacked on the carrier, of course, the first one to take off is going to have the shortest available takeoff roll. And then, of course, as you get further back the carrier, you'd be able to use the full deck. So Jimmy Doolittle himself took the most hazardous and highest risk takeoffs, and then also leading by example by taking off first. I like the fact that, you know, some of these nicknames of these planes, not all of them had nicknames, but if you go into the Force Museum, you could see they had what Rupture Duck Eye, what was the tail, the nose art that was on the one they used in the video. I've always liked that ever since I've been making this presentation. The Harry Carrier, if you know Harry Carrier, that was the honorable way to depart from life with honor, the military tradition of the Japanese. So the Harry Carrier. But that was the name of some of it. The aircraft commander is listed as the pilot right there. These 16 planes, each with 5 people on board. The other thing you'll notice on this chart talks about the targets, a lot of them going after the different ones in Tokyo, but not all of them. You know, you had 3 go to Yokohama, 2 to Nagoya, and then you had 1 by itself going to Kobe. So on the planes, 2,000 pounds, this is 4 500-pound bombs, 3 of which were high explosive, 1 of which was incendiary. So 500 pounders, there we go, the 3 high explosives. The bundle of incendiaries there on the right, you can actually see what the mock-up of that looks like. Those would come out, and those individual magnesium fire starters, if you will, that would scatter across the ground like a cluster bomb. But the whole idea is because of the wooden structure and rice paper roof and all construction that it would hopefully start widespread fires that ended up being very successfully used later on in the war. But the whole idea was to be able to have some explosion, some fire that was left behind. Interestingly, the picture in the lower left right now is Jimmy Doolittle putting one of these 5 friendship medals on the bombs themselves. They were awarded to U.S. servicemen by the Japanese government before the war had started. And I guess this was their way of wanting to send them back saying, thanks for the friendship. But they literally strapped 5 of these friendship medals to the bombs on some of the aircraft that were going to go bomb homeland Japan. So a total of 16 were flown to Alameda from Eglin. The whole force was actually designed to be 15 airplanes. They took the 16th on an agreement because they wanted to prove to the Navy that they could do what they were supposed to do. The Navy didn't believe them. So they were going to take 16 airplanes out, have 1 take off the coast and return back to the U.S. and carry out the mission with 15 planes. Once it got on, decided not to do that. I guess they believed them or something, and they kept that 16th plane and integrated it into the mission itself. So Hornet and its task force got underway. I think this is an AI-generated picture because I've only found it on a couple sources. You would think that would be a very famous picture, so that's either artwork or AI-generated, one or the other. But off they went from California. So look at the timelines in all of this. You know, 31 March, the planes show up. 2 April, they're loaded on and off and going. All this has been happening within months, not years, months. The timeline is amazing. When you think of what it would take us to do anything nowadays, the innovation and the ability to get her done was absolutely fantastic. North of Hawaii, they ended up meeting up with General Halsey's task force with the USS Enterprise. The video at the beginning talked about the crew on the Enterprise when they joined up with the Hornet and what they were able to see. But basically, they had this carrier task force whose job it was going to be to help cover in case there was an attack or something, this somewhat vulnerable aircraft carrier that wasn't able to launch its own fighters because the B-25s were filling up the flight deck. And as you saw on that map, and I'll show you again on the maps here in a little bit, they're getting perilously close to Japan, well within their rings of influence, their island chains. So they had to pick out a route that was going to take them very quietly away from any known pickets or observation islands, posts, anything else. They did carry fighters on the Hornet, but they were all stowed below deck, and there was no place really to put them up on top. However, there's some pictures that prove otherwise. This is apparently one of the pictures as they were crossing. You can actually see a couple fighters stuffed there in the back. And what you'll notice is the two B-25s in tandem at the tail end of the aircraft carrier. What's interesting is another picture of the same voyage looks a lot different. You don't see the fighters up there, and you don't see them parked tandemly. So they were playing musical airplanes at some point on this trip, arranging the flight deck the way that they wanted it. Not a whole available photographs, of course, at that time, but it's amazing the quality and all that we're able to see. So as the original plan, when Jimmy Doolittle was looking at how to do this, he originally wanted to go to Vladivostok in Russia because it was a whole lot closer, and that way they were able to take off farther away and still make a safe landing spot. Russia and Japan were not at war. Russia was friendly at that time with us because of Lend-Lease and everything else that was going on, but they had signed a peace treaty, if you will, with Japan at the time, or a lack of hostilities treaty. So that was, and the Russians weren't cooperative. They were basically saying because of that treaty, they didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to be implicated in all of this. They turned them down. So the plan B became to go to China. Now, Japan was occupying a great deal of the north part of China, but not the south. So the idea was to be able to come off Japan and then go to the friendly areas in the south part of China. So a name that should sound familiar, Chiang Kai-shek, who ended up the Chinese national, he was the one in charge down there at the time, knew that this was going to cause a lot of problems if they helped the Doolittle Raiders at the end, but they did it anyway, because they knew it was going to be important. There were going to be original refueling stops along the coast in China that then would allow them to fuel up and continue on to a more inland safe location later on. Problem was, as they were approaching, they were about 150 miles from where they wanted to be to launch, they ran into that patrol boat. So it was only a 70-ton patrol craft. I chuckle because it says it was sunk by gunfire from Nashville. I'm not sure if it says that on there because part of my screen's covered up. The Nashville fired over 900 rounds out of its guns to sink this 70-ton patrol boat that apparently had radioed off a warning to Japan prior to being sunk. I'm not sure if the Japanese didn't believe it or what, or if it was a minimalist response. But the bottom line is now they had a dilemma. They knew that they were no longer silent. They were no longer stealthy. They were no longer hidden from the eyes and ears of the Japanese. So they just got together and made a decision, and they decided it was time to launch. It was earlier and farther away than they'd planned to be, but they decided that was going to be acceptable risk to get the job done. This is one of the original pictures of the B-25 heading off of on its way. So as they left the Hornet, the 16 bombers flying at low level, about 500 feet off the ocean to try and stay out of sight for ships. As the lower you are, the less distance somebody's going to be able to see you on the open ocean. So they were trying to fly that low level, and it took, as you heard in the video, almost 5 hours for them to arrive over the target. And it's interesting when you think about it. I would think they would have attacked Tokyo from the east by the logic. But if you, and this particular map you're looking at right now is a little bit off, they actually end up coming in from the north over Tokyo and then down to those other cities that you can see, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and all in the further south part of the mainland Japan. The damage itself was pretty minimal. About noontime, 6 hours after the launch, they climbed from 500 feet up to about 1,500 feet to release their bombs. 10 different targets over the course of those 5 different cities that they were targeting. The lower left is the only picture I've ever found that was apparently taken by one of Doolittle Raiders' aircraft. Of course, we'll talk about the disposition of the planes and how they got this picture and everything back. I'm not sure. You really can't tell much from this picture other than that looks like it's the front of one of the prop on one of the engines, and that is Japan, but there's no bombs going off or anything else in that particular picture. Little anti-aircraft fire, but really Japan thought their homeland was safe from any kind of attack. So they were deploying most of their troops, most of their defenses forward, and there was very little at home. There was some light anti-aircraft fire and slight damage to one of the planes, but no bomber was shot down. There's the light battle damage from Lieutenant Joyce's aircraft, minor hits. And one of them was concerned enough about the fighter jets, sorry, that's my lingo, the fighters that were launched against them, that they jettisoned their bombs, which is even today a common thing. If you think you're going to have to turn with somebody, you want to get rid of weight. So they jettisoned their bombs before the target, just one of the aircraft, the number 4 off of the raid. So 15 of the planes decided to go on to China as the plan. One of them was low enough on fuel that they decided they were going to go to Vladivostok, even though that was not an approved course of action. I've always been curious how that debrief went, but they were actually able to get to Russia and land. It was a little bit north of Vladivostok. I'll show you the plane here in just a little bit. But the other 15 went on down to China, but the airfields that they were supposed to land at weren't ready for them. So they, at this point, it was actually getting dark and no lights were on. They couldn't find them, and they all ended up ditching and crashing as a result. So 15 of the 16 B-25s were lost in the initial raid itself. The raid, this is the picture behind me right now. This is an artist's work. As I said, not a lot of damage to the targets themselves. Just a couple of 500-pound bombs across large targets. The damage was really more psychological than anything else, and we'll talk about psychological here in just a little bit. The 16th airplane was the one with Captain York, actually ended up, as I said, not in Vladivostok itself, but an airfield that was actually north of Vladivostok and ended up landing. That's the actual airplane itself, the only surviving B-25 out of the Doolittle Raid, which was taken by the Soviets. They were treated, the crew was actually treated nice. They were held as captives, if you will, but let's call it a pretty nice captivity for them because the U.S. were friends. Of the 15 that reached the Chinese coast, almost 13 hours flying in a prop airplane, I can't even imagine. There were a few fatalities. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But 2 of the crews were actually missing. They had no idea. The other ones got to China. They were able to account for a lot of them, but for many years, they didn't know what happened to 2 of the crews or 10 of the men. And you can see they were actually greeted by the Chinese themselves in a very friendly fashion. The picture on the right was actually Doolittle's airplane. So there's a crash, his B-25 crash, and once again, my right side of my screen is covered up, but that is Jimmy Doolittle that's actually visible in that picture at that point. So none of them were able to refuel. The idea was that Halsey was supposed to send a signal to the Chinese and let them know they were en route. Well, Halsey never sent that signal. Once again, I was always curious what would happen when Jimmy Doolittle did meet Admiral Halsey later on in the war, what that conversation consisted of, because what was supposed to happen didn't, and it put them clearly at risk as a result. Now, how often do you watch a briefing where you're going to see a steaming pile of crap? But quite literally, Doolittle landed in a pile of steaming, what they call it, dung. I talked about his ankle injury that he'd had previously, but it actually made for a soft landing. I guess it was a stinky but soft landing that he had when he parachuted out. That longest ever bombing raid by a B-25. And you remember early on, it talked about its range normally being 12 or 1,300 miles, and there you go, 2,250 miles. 8 of the raiders were actually captured by the Japanese in China. And these are some that their fate wasn't known until later on. There's the famous picture of one of the raiders, Captain Haidt, who was captured. And then we have the aircraft that was nicknamed Bat Out of Hell, where they had these individual crews, and you can see that 2 of them were executed and 1 died in captivity. So of the 80 airmen who participated in it, you can see at the very bottom row in this graphic we're showing right here, 8 captured by Japan, but only 4 of them actually ended up being returned at the end of the war. 3 were executed, 1 died in captivity. 3 died in the raid, a couple when they bailed out, and one bailed out without getting a good shoot. 5 landed in Russia, but they did make it back to the United States later on in the war. One of the consequences of the Doolittle Raid was that the Japanese were mad. They were pissed off that their homeland had been bombed, and they know that the Chinese had helped. So, I mean, if there were trinkets, any kind of evidence that they could find the U.S., they'd kill almost 250,000 civilians, it was said, as a result of this raid. Once again, the Chinese were very supportive of it because they knew it was important for the whole shifting of the balance of what was going on in the Pacific. But there's some nice pictures of them with the Chinese before we could get into that whole campaign. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. The Japanese that went on the killing rampage as a result of the Doolittle Raid. Doolittle thought it was a complete disaster. He thought that what happened, the fact that no airplanes returned, was a disaster. He was expecting to get court-martialed. Little did he know, he actually got the Medal of Honor. It was received, and he was skipped a rank. So Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle became Brigadier General Doolittle. So never in his career was he Colonel Doolittle. He skipped right over, and then ends up proceeding to get a couple more stars throughout the course of his career. So when we look at the overall picture, this is the span of control of Japan at the extent of their empire, which was when the Doolittle Raid happened. You can see the different landmarks around there, whether it was Midway Island and all. But as a result of Doolittle's raid, the Japanese, who had thought their homeland was completely secure, ended up redeploying almost 4 fighter groups, hundreds of fighter aircraft back to their homeland to defend mainland Japan. These were airplanes that were no longer available for their other operations, either in China or around the Pacific. The same with hundreds of thousands of troops, anti-aircraft equipment, and everything. Basically, it was a game changer. It was a game changer in the way, and I'll show you here in just a minute, but just looking at this geographically, one of the things that Japan did as a result is their strike at Midway Island. As a direct result of this, they changed their strategy and they realized that Midway Island was a threat that they needed to address. And if you know the history, the Battle of Midway Island is where they lost a number of their key aircraft carriers, and then the balance of naval power significantly shifted in the Pacific as a result. Once again, this can all draw back to Doolittle's raid and what happened as a result of that. For those of you who don't know, when I talk about seizing the initiative, nowadays this is John Boyd, Colonel John Boyd, and his philosophies so much drove the design of the F-16, the F-18, and a lot of the ways that we approach combat today. But this little circles over there on his left is called the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, and act. And the whole idea is that you are seizing the initiative. You are making your adversary react to you. You're able to see what's going on, collect information, figure out what you want to do, act on it, and keep that circle going faster than your enemy can react. So what happened was this whole theory of the OODA loop, before it was ever even called that, we shifted. Now we owned the initiative. And for the rest of the time in the Pacific, it went from Japan, us reacting to Japan reacting to us and our allies. And that was the critical thing that changed throughout the Pacific as a result of the Doolittle Raid. There it is, John Boyd and the OODA loop. But it wasn't over. You would think after all that you'd kind of hang up your hat, but oh no, Jimmy Doolittle went on. He pinned on other stars. He became commanders of North Africa, the Mediterranean, England. Throughout the course of the war, he was a key player, a key leader through the Army Air Corps. And then actually towards the end of the war, actually started very much getting strategically into the idea of a separate Air Force. 26 years after his retirement, he was ceremoniously pinned on with his 4th star. So he was a 3-star when he retired, but there you go, 1985. That is Jimmy Doolittle at his grand old age there, without a name tag on, by the way, 26 years after he retired. All right, awards. There was lots of them. All 80 got the Distinguished Flying Cross. Those that were wounded got the Purple Heart. The Chinese gave medals to all of the Doolittle Raiders. And then, of course, we had others for their Silver Star for what they were able to do, particular actions themselves. Jimmy Doolittle very specifically pushed to make sure that every one of the Doolittle Raiders was promoted as a result of their actions. So one of the weird things, if you've ever heard the term Shangri-La, that actually comes from a novel about this mystical, fictional, faraway land. So when President Roosevelt was asked, how did we bomb Japan? He said, it must have been from Shangri-La. Well, the details of how the raid actually happened were a secret until almost a year after. Interestingly enough, the Navy decided to take that whole thing with the president making that comment and named an aircraft carrier the USS Shangri-La, which was an active carrier, I believe it was until the mid-1960s. But if you look at who the sponsor was, it was Doolittle's wife. They're the ones that actually break the bottle over the ship, christening it, et cetera, and all that. But we named a ship after the president's comment as a result of Doolittle's raid. Of course, there's a movie. The movie came out during the war. So they make this movie about American heroes and all, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, in 1944. There was a book that came out, and I haven't even mentioned Doolittle passed away in 1993. So a book came out, an autobiography, in 1997. So he must have approved it early on with Miss Carol Glines there. I have not read that book, but as a result of getting ready for this briefing, this presentation, this toast, I am going to be ordering a copy of that to read it. There was also a documentary that was made in the not too distant past about the final toast, the Doolittle Raiders, and that was the last one they actually did at the Air Force Museum with the 3 survivors. The Chinese built a museum near where the Doolittle Raiders had crashed, but it was to commemorate not just the Doolittle Raiders, but all the Chinese who helped them as a result. So China, not too long ago, building a museum focusing on a friendship, a partnership with the United States. Jimmy, too bad he was never really successful at anything. After all that time at the war, he was one of the visionaries, the one that realized that what happened between the wars, when we demobilized after World War I and the situation it left us in World War II, decided to help another group of, the pioneering aviators establish the Air Force Association. And it was actually early in 1946 that the AFA was established. And it wasn't until September of 1947 that the Air Force became a separate service. But he was the first president. So that's why you see so many things with the Air Force Association that happen to wear that name, Doolittle this, that, or the other. He became the vice president of Shell Oil. Also that next year, did that for over a decade. Director, Space Technology Laboratories, TRW, Inc. He stayed on not as a vice president, but as a director, as in a capacity for almost another 10 years at Shell Oil. He was an advisor to the Air Force, an advisor to the CIA, advisor to several presidents. He was the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board for a period of time, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board for a decade, and most interestingly enough, was offered to be the first administrator of NASA, and he turned him down. So poor Jimmy Doolittle was not successful at all in his career. I say sarcastically, what an amazing individual with background, knowledge, and everything else that was able to make the Doolittle Raid happen. The first reunion in December of 1945, they completely trashed the hotel in Miami to the point where they were asked not to come back in there. But they decided to do their anniversary on Jimmy Doolittle's birthdays. So that's how it all got started. It wasn't until a lot later, well, I'll talk about Tucson here in just a little bit, but the whole idea of the toast is they would get together all of the survivors. They would have a roll call and they would put a toast to the fellow survivors. Eventually, a little bit later on, they get these engraved silver goblets with the names. If the people had already passed away when they made the goblets, their names were inverted. If they were alive and then passed away later on, they inverted the goblets itself with the names as they passed away. But it was Tucson that presented those 80 silver goblets to the Raiders, and it wasn't until 1959. So almost a decade, they just did their toasts. It wasn't until later that the silver goblets became that iconic symbol of the Doolittle Raiders toast itself. The Hennessy, if you actually go to the Air Force Museum, that's the same bottle that they have sitting in there, 1896 Hennessy Cognac. Apparently he had very elaborate tastes, so Doolittle's favorite. And then we'll talk about the toast itself. But the last surviving Doolittle Raiders was the one who had actually built that wooden case. And that's what it looks like, and that's where it sits today in the Air Force Museum in Dayton. If we do get another trip down there, there's an entire display about, obviously, the Doolittle Raiders, a B-25 bomber, and so much more. But it explains all about the goblets, and you can see that a couple are removed from their cubbies and are out by the bottle of cognac there. And just an example, this was the 64th reunion in Dayton, and at this point, what do we have? 8 survivors at that particular time. This is at the Air Force Museum. This is the last surviving Doolittle Raider, Dick Cole, and here he was in 2022 flying an airplane, imagine, if you will. But Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cole, the last surviving of the Doolittle Raiders. Last one they did in person was actually with just 3. Sorry, I grabbed a picture that has 4 right here, but it was just Cole, Sailor, and Thatcher that were there for that very last toast that was done in 2013. And I said it wasn't until many years later that Cole actually passed away, but 2013 was the last time that they had the toast. So, if you will, charge your glass, join me for a toast. What you're seeing on the screen is the actual words of what they said every single time. So as we get ready here, so I will propose the toast and your response will be there in yellow. After the toast, I will ask that you join me for about 30 seconds of silence as a result, as we just ponder the innovation, the patriotism, and the amazing spirit of these men that made this happen. So, excuse me, if you join me, to the Doolittle Raiders, who gave their all in success of their mission, and to those who have joined them since.
To those who have gone.
Those who have gone.
And now please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. So also as a result, if you all did not know, our new B-21 bomber, which is going to be the replacement for the B-2 stealth bomber, did its initial flight a couple months ago. But in 2016, Northrop Grumman named this plane that hadn't flown yet, and they're naming it Raider. And the reason, of course, excuse me, is because of the Doolittle Raiders themselves. If you notice, it was announced at a ceremony at the Air Force Association conference in Washington, D.C. in 2016. The only one survivor at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Cole, was present at that, but that is the name, that is the legacy, that is the history of what they're trying to portray in the new B-21 Raider bomber. All right, so my interpretations real quick. Leadership lessons from Jimmy Doolittle, things that we can take away from this. 1, amazing things can be accomplished if you put aside ego and fear. Can you imagine what these men and everybody involved with this were thinking at the time? Their families, that they're going overseas. They didn't even know originally what the target was, why they were doing it, but they said, yes, send me. I want to be part of this, something bigger than myself. Can you imagine their thought? I don't even have enough gas to get where I'm supposed to go, yet we're going anyway. Innovation and risk-taking, it's amazing. They took something that had never been done before, an idea, they proved that it could work, an airplane that wasn't designed to do what it did, on an aircraft carrier that wasn't designed to help do what they did, to do a mission that they were told was impossible. And we can go on and on. There weren't procedures. There wasn't training. Can you imagine this day and age, if we were to try and talk about something like this, all the thousands of reasons, not only the engineers, but the lawyers would tell us why you can't do that. And yet, within a matter of months, they did. They were able to fulfill that vision. They were able to change the entire course of the World War II in the Pacific as a result. Being a role model for others. I always wonder, if somebody was tasked with something like that today, would they be sitting in a command post watching what's happening with the others? Not Jimmy Doolittle. He was the first one off. He was basically saying, follow me, being a real leader, and showing others, this is the way to do things. And that is what a leader should do. So what a fantastic role model he was on so many fronts. He also trusted the team. I mean, I'm guessing he didn't second guess when the guy said he was going to Vladivostok. All right, good on you. That was your decision based on the circumstances you had at the time. But he had, 15 other aircraft besides his own. He had his own team that you had to basically harry your skills. At this point, it's up to you. He even turned some off to their own targets, all on their own. And if you look, some of those were lieutenants. Can you imagine in this day and age giving a mission to a lieutenant to go out and go bomb something in enemy territory by yourself? Poo happens. Not only do you land in it, but what happened that wasn't expected on this? Lots. And yet we have to expect the unexpected. We have to realize that things are going to happen that we can't expect. We always talk about not, the greatest plan doesn't survive first contact. Well, that's true, but how you handle it as a leader is what's important. I'm guessing he wasn't stomping his feet and griping and complaining when it was time to go. He was cheering everybody on, inspiring them to be able to achieve the objectives of which they'd set out because he knew how important it was. And the last, you trust people, you teach them to do the job, you organize, train, and equip, and then you get the hell out of their way. All right. So my salute to everybody here. One, to the Doolittle Raiders. What an amazing group of individuals, not just the people in the airplanes themselves, not just the leadership, but think about the entire team, the industry, the families, the infrastructure, everybody involved, that, let's call it the supply chain of the Doolittle Raid. Absolutely amazing teamwork, focused on a mission and getting it done. And all of you for being part of this. The AFA, what we're doing is to continue this legacy. We're enabling innovation. We're enabling people to be amazing at what they do in our air and space forces. And we need to continue to advocate for them so they get the equipment, they get the support, they get the policies, those types of things to be able to do what they need to do when the nation calls on them. And you're part of that. As we finish up here, I think we have a couple minutes for questions, all if we need to. And Brian, you'll be very, very happy with me. There's the UPC code. If you are not a member of the AFA, pull your phone out. It's really easy. I think they even have a special going on for $20 a year. That's all it costs. And then you get the magazine and everything else as a result. If you're not a member of the AFA, please consider joining us. It's not a money-making thing. We get nothing of it other than to plug you in to what's going on and all this amazing stuff. My contact information for the Michigan AFA is there at the bottom if you have any questions. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to just leave the UPC code up here a minute. I'm going to check the chat. That is most awesome. I am going to stop sharing the screen and turn it over. If you have any questions, I will stop us at 7:30. I promise I don't go on longer than I need to, but we have 4 minutes for questions if anybody has any. Fire away.
Who built the B-25?
That is a grand question. North American.
And where was it constructed at, do you know?
They said they picked him up in Cincinnati, but as I'm looking on here very quick on my quick Google, it says that it had plants in California and Kansas. So I'm not sure. Maybe they were just being modified in Cincinnati at the time.
It was a remarkable aircraft.
And it is. And somebody had the greatest idea for me 2 days ago when they said, why don't you host this from the B-25 down at the Yankee Air Museum? So that's fantastic. I wish I'd have thought of, got that input a couple weeks ago when I could have made that happen. But maybe in the future we can do just that, or maybe even from down in Dayton, maybe we can record some stuff there with the goblets, with, of course, the plane down there is painted up like one of the Raiders because we don't have any surviving B-25s from that raid. But one of the many that Dayton is so good about with the Air Force Museum. Any other questions?
I think we should have you come speak to some of our companies. I mean, this is a great, I'm thinking, with the company I'm working with, obviously, this is a great story of, American tradition, innovation, grit, leadership. And so, yeah, I want to bring you into the company I'm working with and have you do a version of this presentation and then talk a little bit about yours. I think your career, I think people need to see that and hear it. So.
Okay. I'm more than happy to do that. This is the neat stuff. I mean, when we came up with the idea of doing this, honestly, I had to do a lot of research. So here's my question to you while we have just a couple minutes. What did you learn tonight that you didn't know before tonight about the Doolittle Raid? Anybody?
Yeah, that's quite a bit actually from my standpoint. Yeah, I'm reflecting on that original artwork of the aircraft carrier approaching the Golden Gate Bridge, where they're all stacked up. And I remarked to Jamie during the presentation that, well, that lead plane at the very tip had absolutely no runway to take off from, and that was Doolittle's plane. There's nothing there to go from. And okay, it's scale, I understand all that, but the point was, you look back at that the other 15 airplanes that had to fly, and he was going with just nothing. What grit and determination and leadership. It's a remarkable story to me. It's just fascinating.
And the idea, of course, they didn't have catapults at the time, which we use today with aircraft carriers. But, if you ever watch the iconic movies, with an aircraft carrier, they always talk about, okay, steer it into the wind.
Yep.
Because if you think about it, whatever wind, of course, that's wind over your wings that you didn't even have to accelerate to get. Yep. Well, now you've got a ship traveling at 25 knots. So if the ship's at 25 knots into a 25 knot headwind, that's 50 knots that you've got just right there off the start. Yep. So I'm sure they were all seriously hoping for a really good wind at launch time.
For sure.
And that extra 10, 15, 20 miles per hour, if you will, head start.
Yeah, we know how accurate weather predictions are today. I can't imagine how they were, 80 years ago.
Okay. Anybody else? What did you learn tonight? Anything that stood out?
The thing that stood out to me was the leadership of Jimmy Doolittle. The young people today, or the people today, need to understand his strength of leadership that basically changed the war. That's what I learned today.
So I didn't know he had such an advanced degree and the fact that was the first kind of that thing. And so he was an innovator from way back. I mean, and which is why his career was so outstanding through his entire career, right? It wasn't just like, if you kind of didn't know that piece, you might think that he was given those responsibilities just because he did a good job at with this mission, but it was a long-standing career of innovation. And, so that was the part I didn't know anything about.
Yeah, I mean, the outside loop, okay, he's doing things with airplanes that shouldn't have been able to do. And then instruments, that alone, I mean, who thinks of that as leading edge stuff? But the first one to fly an airplane into a cloud and be able to fly it. And that, unlike Brian's 182. No, we won't get into that. All right. Well, my contact information is up there. Hopefully everybody knows how to get in touch if you have any questions on things going forward. But it was just a great opportunity today to reflect on history, on innovation, on leadership, and so many different things that Jimmy Doolittle set the bar. You know why now. He was the first president of what is now the Air and Space Forces Association. This is the organization that you're plugged into. This is the leadership that started this. This is our legacy of why we do what we do. So on that note, we will go ahead and sign off tonight once again with a salute from me to everybody who participated. I appreciate you all dearly, and I hope that we continue just to grow and to be able to have a bigger impact here in Michigan, and we'll do that with your help. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you hopefully next Friday in Ann Arbor. Talk a little bit more serious about some suicide prevention and our veterans. Thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you.